Hi everyone, I'm Kyle Bechet, and this is the AAF Exchange, a podcast from the American Action Forum, where experts provide clear, data-driven insights into today's economic and domestic policy issues. Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. On this episode of the AAF Exchange, housing affordability, the national debt, and dollar dominance. Joining us to discuss all of this, AAF President Douglas Holtz-Eakin and policy analyst Jacob Jensen. Doug, thanks for joining us.
It is always a pleasure to be here.
It's always great to have you on. Tell us what's been on your mind recently.
So there was this very, very short note in the Financial Times about the National Institute for Healthcare Excellence in Britain denying purchase coverage of an Alzheimer's drug from Eli Lilly. And what they said was, look, this delays the onset of Alzheimer's for 4 to 7 months, and it's just not worth it. So it's not cost effective, and so it will not be covered, and they will not have access in England. Now, I don't care about the merits of the drug or their decision. I just like to point out the way this feeds into the never-ending drug debate in the United States, drug pricing debate. There is a presumption in the United States that other countries get all the drugs that we have on the same timetable that we get them, and their prices are tiny by comparison. And that's just not what goes on. What Britain just did is something the U.S. never does. It said, no, we will not purchase this drug. How do you get a good price? You say no. I mean, and if you don't say no, you're going to pay more. There's no question about it. I mean, you have no bargaining power. So what you see in other countries is lower financial prices, but you pay a different price in that they get delayed access when they get it. It takes often 2, maybe 3 years for a drug that's available in the U.S. to show up in other markets, and sometimes you don't get it at all. So they're just not going to cover some therapies. And I think there has to be a little realism injected in the U.S. debate. We're not going to get every new drug, every new therapy, often for small populations at enormous expense, cheaply. It's just not going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to your underlying point that none of this. Yeah, a lot of people don't understand how this works.
Right.
And it's just it's an ongoing thing, and you're going to pay for it one way or another. You're either not going to have access to the drug, or you're going to have to pay for it.
And we also fall victim to many cheap stereotypes, like all drugs are too expensive. Actually, no. By global standards, our generics are much cheaper than other countries and far more plentiful. So, let's stop pretending that all drugs are created equal. There's one size fits all problems and solutions. That's not the way it works.
Right, because you can cherry pick. This drug's too expensive.
There's no question.
This person has, but that's going to happen in a free market economy like this.
And in some cases, things are going to be more expensive because the nature of the beast has changed dramatically. The biggest thing going on in Part D, for example, is when the Part D benefit was created, probably the biggest, quote, problem was covering the cost of statins, which are relatively cheap. Lots of seniors are on them. Now we have seniors who are basically being treated for cancer as a chronic condition. Like they live with it for years and years and years, and oncology drugs are really expensive. Mm-hmm. That price tag is much bigger, so it's a different burden for the program to bear.
Right. All right, let's turn to a different issue, issue of housing. Fannie Mae released a somewhat alarming report on housing affordability. What did we learn?
So this was in a Bloomberg story, and they referred to some Fannie Mae calculations that said, suppose we want to get U.S. housing affordability back to 2016 to 2019 average levels. What has to happen? Well, house prices have to fall by 38%. Okay, so that's known as a housing crisis.
Yeah.
We did the housing bubble and crash before. That's what that looked like. So not really a fan. Median income would have to rise by 60%. Given the pace of growth in the 21st century, that's 17 years away. That's not particularly promising. Or interest rates on mortgages, 30-year fixed-rate mortgages, have to go down to something like 2.35%, somewhere in that vicinity. They've never been there. Okay, so that seems bad.
Yeah.
And it turns out what they're doing is Fannie Mae is using an index of affordability from the National Association of Realtors, where you basically look at what fraction of my income gets chewed up by the mortgage principal and interest.
Right.
And if it turns out that you have to have a much bigger income to shoulder that, then housing is unaffordable. That's roughly what's going on here. So you got incomes to go up, or house prices to go down, or mortgage rates to go way down to hit the 25% target. So that's all quite alarming and tells you a real story about the housing market in general. I don't think there's anything wrong with that basic message, but it's not going to be true for every American.
Right.
It's going to be different in different housing markets. I can attest to you that the housing market in Washington, D.C. is different than that in Syracuse, New York. Very different. Incomes are different across the country. Financial conditions really aren't. We have integrated financial markets, but you're going to have sort of a case-by-case basis on the return of affordability to different housing markets, and that's what's worth looking at. This is just an alarming report that says no one's ever going to be able to buy a house again.
Right, yeah. I mean, because it's taking everything and looking at it in the aggregate.
Right.
Like I think the article looked at, 3 different, it looked at like Philadelphia, Atlanta, and Las Vegas. And
yes, let's find the 3 worst cases.
Yeah, and use those as the case study for this. But I'm sure that, what's true there is not true everywhere. Is there something like a middle ground where like things can just, move? You can move the needle on not crashing the housing market.
So the good news is that the best cure for high prices is high prices.
Yeah.
Because that's a real lure to build things. And then you get increased supply. And then, the counter argument is, well, they can't build things because of local zoning laws. That's the culprit that usually shows up in this discussion. But if there's a lot of money on the table, the developers are going to be at the town meeting every time they get together and say, look, can we just get this? Can we rethink this? Can we have a strip where we can do some high density building? You look at Arlington, where I live.
Yeah.
The area above the metro is high density. That has all the condo buildings, has all the tall apartment buildings. Everything outside that is sort of traditional single family residential lots. And so there are ways to manage this. And if there's a big enough need for housing and a big enough lure for the suppliers to build it, it'll happen.
Yeah.
It just doesn't happen fast. And the impatience here is what's, I think, so notable.
I know like Alexandria, for instance, is also dealing with this right outside of D.C. I think they have a mayoral race, and one of their hot button issues is the single family versus high density zoning type stuff.
So,
interesting
in the spirit of the drug discussion, there isn't a one-size-fits-all housing problem either.
I'm sensing a trend here. What have we heard from the presidential campaigns on this issue?
This has sort of become a little bit of a sleeper issue. Mr. Trump has promised to free up federal lands for people to build on, which sounds great, since one of the problems is getting access to the land, but the federal land is usually not in the middle of metropolitan areas. And so if you always wanted that rustic mountain cabin, this sounds promising, but I'm not sure it's going to make a big dent on the housing market. And Harris has promised to build 3 million units over the next 5 years or so. That's a drop in the bucket, and there's no real explanation how that's going to happen. So, yeah, there's a problem. We hear you. I think both would be well served to focus less on that direct intervention in the housing market, and more on let's have the economy grow better, give people more income, and let them deal with it that way.
I've also heard former President Trump talk about regulations in this regard.
Yes, certainly. Let's deregulate.
Yeah.
Housing is one of the most regulated products you can possibly buy. I think of all the local zoning, building codes, and increasingly energy codes that come from climate regs. So yeah, there's some progress that can be made on that front, but again, the federal government holds relatively few of those levers. These are much more located at the local level.
Gotcha. All right, let's turn to an issue that I know you're a fan of talking about. Earlier this week, Treasury released its final monthly statement for fiscal year 2024. To no one's surprise, the news was bad. Walk us through the numbers.
We came in at $1.8 trillion for the fiscal year 2024 federal deficit. Closed the books on September 30th. I was kind of rooting for 2. If you're going to get into this territory, go big. But 1.8 is 6.3% of GDP in an economy that's operating essentially at full employment, is not on a wartime footing, and is facing no national emergency. In the quaint old days when we seemed to care about these things, 3% of GDP was viewed as an upper bound. So we're way off the reservation.
Yeah.
As we have discussed in the past, the first thing you need to get is some recognition that this is a problem. And the problem is that every year that we do this, we eat away at future productivity and thus the future standard of living. And so this is literally robbing from the future generations to satisfy current wants. And I think it's just inappropriate. And so you got to get a recognition there's a cost and then figure out what you're going to do about it. And there's a line of thinking on the left that says we're just going to raise taxes, and particularly rich people's taxes.
Yeah.
And that's just not going to work. Arithmetically, that's not going to work because the spending is growing faster than even a tax system with higher rates would generate. There's an argument on the right that says we'll just grow more rapidly. And again, there's no way we're going to raise the growth rate of the economy by 2 full percentage points over a 10-year period, for example. Not in the realm. So you got to get serious about the spending programs and particularly big entitlement programs. And we're just not willing to be.
Yeah, just to put it into a little bit of perspective for me, you said the quaint old days. I think I saw earlier that we passed the $1 trillion on debt mark back in 1981 or something like that, and then now this is the $1 trillion mark on deficits. So we've come a long way in.
We passed the $1 trillion mark on interest on debt this year.
Yeah, wow.
Right, that happened just prior to the close of the books in September. We got interest on the debt was larger than $1 trillion for the first time. It is now larger than every federal program except Social Security. Bigger than Medicare, bigger than the Pentagon. Pick your favorite program. Interest on the debt is bigger.
When our former colleague Gordon used to do those pie charts that showed interest just growing and growing, interest on debt just growing and growing, it was very alarming, and I wish more people had the same alarm on it.
Yeah, it should be alarming.
Yeah.
This is just basic financial mismanagement.
And I mean, so it is fair to say that in Washington, let alone any of the political candidates out there are talking seriously about addressing the looming debt crisis.
Correct.
Nevertheless, AAF did the work for them, has put forward a framework to do so. So walk us through that plan.
So we did, in fact, put together a framework. To have a strategy on the debt, you first have to have a target. What would you like to do? The near-term target is stabilize the debt relative to GDP and then have it point south so that we're diminishing the debt relative to GDP. That was our goal. Then you have to have a set of instruments to reach your target, and we're using all the artillery. On the tax side, we're going to raise more revenue, but we're going to do it in a very efficient pro-growth fashion. With a consumption-oriented tax, destination-based cash flow taxes. We're also going to get rid of the underbrush on the climate front and just go to an upstream carbon tax, generates some revenue, but also doesn't damage the efficiency of the economy in dealing with climate. So that's the tax side. On the spending side, Social Security reform, Medicare reform in the form of making fee-for-service Medicare compete with Medicare Advantage, bidding systems to control things. We've done some elaborate microsimulation models, and then further reforms for the smaller programs, and notably, because I believe deeply that the annual discretionary spending, the place where we do basic research, education, infrastructure, and national security, that's gotten squeezed out by these entitlement programs. We're going to spend more on defense. It's not a safer world, and we're going to have a bigger defense budget in this plan. So what happens when you do this? Well, we accomplish our target, we stabilize debt relative to GDP, and then ultimately get it down to about 67%. In a perfect world, I'd get it down to 30% of GDP. That's how we entered the 21st century. But I think this is a template for how you want to do this. And the key is we're not pretending that it's just taxes. We're not pretending it's just growth. We're going to do taxes and growth and spending controls.
Right. It's pulling levers from all the different areas.
There's no way around.
Yeah.
And honestly, I mean, the frightening thing is how hard this is to do, even in a spreadsheet.
Yeah.
I mean, we haven't made it to the real world yet. I mean, we're 100% in.
Yeah, I'm just picturing you walking in with this template to some of these congressional offices and seeing how they feel about it. But because politically, this doesn't operate outside of the political world.
That would be the end of my walking career. Probably, I could kneecapped it.
Yeah. I mean, but it does highlight how hard of an issue it is. It would have been great if people had woken up to this, a few years ago.
Honestly, I don't think it's literally true, but I look back to 2004 when Bush took a run at this at the start of his second term and didn't even get a vote in the House. And that looks like more and more his greatest failure forget what went on in Afghanistan, Iraq, the global war on terror. That moment and the missed opportunity there is huge.
Yeah.
Because that was in time for the retirement of the baby boom generation. That would have been a great Social Security reform platform, but didn't get done.
Yeah, I remember. I remember stories from a couple. So, former Vice President Cheney went to my alma mater at Catholic to give like a lecture on the debt, and I remember some of my professors talking about how that went down and how well received it was then. So I can only imagine.
It's really interesting because it was not left for lack of effort. I mean, I forget the number
They
exactly,
pushed really hard for this.
But the president of the United States made something like 30 or 40 appearances and gave speeches on Social Security reform as a sitting president. That's an enormous allocation of political capital, and they just didn't get anything for it.
I mean, I was still back home in Vermont then, and I remember some of the headlines just being like, the Bush wastes capital, that was the story out of it, which is unfortunate because we're in the mess of it. But anyways, going back to the plan before we wrap up, the Peters, that was Jordan just did a great piece outlining the entire plan on our website. She has a great one-pager on it.
Yes.
So we'll provide both of those in the show notes, and hopefully people go read it.
Yes. She's done a spectacular job on this.
All right. It's time for the favorite part of the round. We're gonna start. We started with healthcare, and so we'll end with healthcare.
Okay.
The 2019 Harris Medicare plan, if implemented by 2028, increases federal spending by X amount over the next decade. It's in the trillions. I'll give you that.
Oh, I know that. I'm just trying to remember if it's something like 2.8 trillion or something like that.
It's 44.
Yikes! Yeah. Oh, this is the Medicare for All.
This is the Medicare for All proposal.
Oh yes.
So yeah,
44 for sure.
That is an astonishing number. As again, we're just talking about the debt.
Right. So I mean, again, the problem with these kinds of proposals that people need to recognize is that one of the things you do is you buy out the base. It's things that were otherwise being paid for in the private sector, you put on the taxpayer's tab. You don't actually increase access to healthcare. You don't increase coverage or anything. You just pick up the tab, and that's a very inefficient way to operate. So if you want to make progress, you have to figure out how to target at the unserved margins, either care that's not being delivered or insurance that's not being available. And otherwise, it's just way too expensive.
Interesting. Well, Doug, thanks for joining us and talking about all these issues. Hope to have you back soon.
Yes.
Jacob, welcome back to the podcast.
Great to be back.
All right, let's just jump right into things. Yeah. As Doug discussed earlier on in the podcast, our own deficit and debt picture is pretty grim, to say it mildly.
Yeah.
But this week is all about international finance. Jacob, tell us what's happening on that front.
Yeah, as you mentioned, it's a big week for all things international economics. We got the IMF and World Bank meetings happening here in D.C., but a little lesser talked about event is happening across the world in Russia. And this is the BRICS Summit that's happening. And for those who are not aware, the BRICS countries include Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And this is essentially just a group of emerging economies that want to create alternatives to Western institutions like the IMF and World Bank. One of these big announcements that's supposed to come out this week, besides the introduction of new members into the BRICS bloc, includes BRICS Pay.
Yeah, I saw President of China Xi Jinping basically come out and say we need an alternative system to fit the new economic world order. What is BRICS Pay?
So the best way to describe it is it's much like an Apple Wallet. So this BRICS Pay will include the currencies of the BRICS countries and other cryptocurrencies. And their intention is to circumvent the US dollar, which is primarily used within the SWIFT international financial system. So this is one step in the direction of creating a BRICS alternative to SWIFT.
Interesting. Could any of this threaten the US economy?
Yeah, so I'd say right now in the near term, it doesn't pose much of a risk. The BRICS Pay and the BRICS alternatives are not widely used, only among like 9 countries compared to SWIFT being used by 200 countries. But it poses a longer-term challenge to the U.S. and the U.S. SWIFT system because BRICS countries include almost half of the global population and soon to be half of the global GDP. So in a near term, no, it's not a threat, but in a longer term, as more BRICS currencies are used in place of the US dollar, it'll certainly threaten US influence.
Interesting. Yeah, and you have a good paper out on this, right?
Yeah, this week I just published a paper on BRICS, and then I've got another one coming up about dollar dominance.
Interesting. So everyone should stay tuned for the dollar dominance, but should go and read the BRICS paper. Jacob, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Tune back in for our next episode, where our experts will provide clear, data-driven insights into today's economic and domestic issues. I'd also encourage you to check out any of the links in our show notes, and also follow us on social media to learn more about AAF. Don't forget to subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, or Google Play.